My name is Mohamed Elmaazi, and this is Truth Defence. On the 22nd of August, the UK-based activist group Jewish Voice for Labour wrote to the UK Labour Party filing a formal complaint over what it described as mistreatment of Jewish people, in particular, Jewish members of the Labour Party. The JVL website notes, quote, "A legal letter to the party from Bindmans LLP on behalf of Jewish Voice for Labour sets out compelling evidence that Jews who disagree with the current leadership about Israel, Palestine, Zionism, and anti-Semitism suffer disproportionately from the party's harsh disciplinary regime. Jewish members are 6 times more likely to be investigated and 9.5 times more likely to be expelled from the Labour Party." Jewish Voice for Labour describes itself as a Jewish-led organization for members of the Labour, trade union, socialist, and progressive movements. The website also states that the organization is an internationalist and anti-racist organization which calls out and fights all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism, and oppose any hierarchy of racism, including notions of Jewish exceptionalism. It also states that it supports the right of Palestinians to self-determination and opposes the oppression of the Palestinian people by the apartheid state of Israel. This is not done in our name, the website notes. Joining us today to discuss the truth of the matter as it relates to the treatment of Jewish and non-Jewish people critical of Zionism and the state of Israel, and UK foreign policy in support of the apartheid regime there, is Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi. Naomi is a founding member of JVL and also works as their media officer. Naomi, thank you for joining us.
Hello, Mohammed. I'm delighted to be with you at this very important moment.
So just briefly, Naomi, can you explain the context of the letter you sent and the complaint being filed?
Yes, thank you, Mohammed. So the letter that Bindmans wrote on our behalf and sent to the Labour Party is a formal complaint about matters that we have been complaining about informally, shall we say, for quite some time now. It gradually became clear to us that the attacks on the pro-Palestinian left within the Labour Party, grouped around Jeremy Corbyn, had this very strange effect, so that whereas party leadership under Starmer is constantly stating its determination to root out anti-Semitism, this is the sort of language they use, zero tolerance and so on. In fact, Jewish people who are supportive of Palestinian rights, and there are very many of us, we naturally tend to have a more than average interest in what goes on in the Middle East because of our history and the relationship that many Jews do have with the state of Israel. It turned out that if you look at the data, we are facing more disciplinary measures than what you would expect, given the small number of Jewish people who are in the Labour Party. I mean, there's no firm data on that, but just, looking around and making a judgment on the proportion of Jewish people in the British population. Note, there are only about 300,000 of us in the UK, though I think lots of people think there are more because people can be very vocal and get a lot of news coverage for their views. So that's a small number. So looking at on that basis, we are clearly being disproportionately impacted by the disciplinary measures that the party has been taking, particularly since the demise of Jeremy Corbyn and the new leadership of Keir Starmer, with David Evans as General Secretary, helping him to clear out all those people who were supporters of Jeremy Corbyn. So, for example, on our executive committee of Jewish Voice for Labour, there are 11 of us, all Jewish, mostly quite elderly Jews, it has to be said, with a long history of activism, anti-racism and trade unionism and solidarity work with many, many great causes. All of us have been disciplined in some way or another. We've either been investigated or suspended, or in at least 4, it's difficult to keep up sometimes, I think it may now be 5 cases, we've been expelled. So I myself was elected to the national executive of the Labour Party last summer as part of a left slate. And once I'd been elected, before I could even take my seat on the national executive, in order to pursue the causes that we've made public as being my concerns, I was suspended, which meant that I couldn't attend any meetings of the new national executive, and then I was expelled on the basis that I had committed a prohibited act. Now, these prohibited acts, this is a new way of getting rid of people that the leadership don't like. They have proscribed a number of organisations on the left, organisations that took a stand against the weaponisation of anti-Semitism. So Labour Against the Witch Hunt is probably the best known of these. And so once the leadership had proscribed these groups, it then became unnecessary for them to prove any particular misdemeanour on the part of someone they wanted to get rid of. They just needed to say, oh, you signed a petition organised by Labour Against the Witch Hunt or another proscribed group. Even if the signing of the petition occurred a year or two or more before the proscription occurred, that is then a prohibited act, and you are subject to automatic exclusion. So there's no disciplinary process, there's no investigation, there's no opportunity for you to argue your case as to why your membership of the Labour Party should stand. You are auto-excluded. Your membership is terminated. This is the kind of language that we find ourselves dealing with. So this has happened. Yeah, go on.
Sorry, actually, I want to ask you, because that's fascinating. I wasn't aware of that last part about that you could be retroactively punished for interaction or working with a prescribed group, even if that interaction occurred before the group was prescribed. Can you... has this been legally challenged, or do you think it's possible to legally challenge the notion or the policy of banning or suspending or expelling a Labour Party member for associations they had with a prescribed group, even if those associations were before the group was prescribed? Because that doesn't seem on.
That doesn't seem on. It's been challenged kind of verbally and informally by a number of people, including National Executive Committee members. It's called retroactivity. The idea that a regulation is brought into play and people are then held to be responsible for breaching it at a time when they couldn't possibly have known that this regulation was going to be enforced in the future. And we've had great minds working through the regulations and trying to find out if it is possible to challenge this. There's a significant case of Pamela Fitzpatrick, who was a parliamentary candidate for Labour under Corbyn. She is a local councillor. She's a very effective activist who is one of those who's been expelled retroactively under this prohibition clause that's been added to the rule book. And it's the problem is, you see, if you as an individual start proceedings against an organisation like the Labour Party, you are setting yourself up for massive costs, which for most people are just completely prohibitive. And so far, I mean, Jewish Voice for Labour has taken a couple of legal cases on behalf of individuals. The most well-known is probably Diana Neslin, an elderly Orthodox Jewish woman living in northeast London, who has been harassed, intimidated, treated in the most abominable fashion because she is an anti-Zionist Jew and vocal about her views. So she has been accused of anti-Semitism 3 times. And the last case, we made a legal challenge on her behalf, and the party has sort of backed off, but it has refused at every stage to exonerate her or to apologise for its behaviour. I mean, to the extent that when she was diagnosed with cancer, her husband died suddenly. She was in a really poor state emotionally and personally, and yet they persisted with these charges against her. And we have failed to get any court to take up her case. I mean, we've made noises about it which have been embarrassing enough for the party to sort of just retract the latest wave of allegations against her, but not to in any way pull back on the original charges that they made. I mean, there are 2 elderly Jewish people who died while fighting charges of anti-Semitism, and the party has shown no sympathy, no attempts to collaborate with the families in clearing their names, no acknowledgement even that these people have expired without being able to clear themselves of a charge of anti-Semitism, and they are Jewish. Andrew Feinstein has made a big play about one of these cases because it's a woman that he knew very well, Reva Joffe, who was a South African Jewish activist. Yeah. So basically the court's attitude tends to be the Labour Party is like a private club. It's no different to if you were in a basket weaving club or organisation or something like that. You're a member, you have to play by the party's rules, and the courts don't want to have anything to do with it, really. So we're in a difficult situation. If you want me to explain a bit about the latest case, we've had a legal letter sent, and but we're calling it a formal complaint. The letter itself says that this is not intended to be a letter before legal action. We don't want to embroil either ourselves or the party in lengthy court proceedings. But if there is no satisfactory response to the party, to the evidence that we've presented them with of disproportionate mistreatment of Jews in the party on questions of anti-Semitism, then we will obviously have to consider what options are open to us. So that's the situation. It's depressing. Over and over again, people say, this person has been so terribly badly treated. Why aren't you suing them? Why aren't you, charging them with libel? It happens all the time with Jeremy. Jeremy's constantly being abused, and he's never taken legal action because, if you're not a multimillionaire, you're going to lose in the English courts. There's no way an English judge is going to say, oh, yes, here's somebody standing up against the Israel lobby, totally backed by the British establishment. I'm not going to put my foot into the water here. It's not going to happen. So we're waiting for a case which is so incontrovertible and where the victim is so evidently innocent and clean and beyond reproach that it might be possible to defend them against this sort of action.
Well, an interesting point that you raised is the issue about the law. I mean, I did observe various cases, including that of Chris Williamson's, and what the judges were saying. It showed that it is possible to judicially review decisions by the Labour Party, by political parties, right? Because it showed that, what decision you'll get and what remedy you'll get from the court is another matter. But it did show that if you can establish to the court's satisfaction that the party engaged in a process that was outside of what would be deemed to be fair and reasonable, that could be challenged. The result is a bit of a different issue, but that they came to the wrong result, because judicial review is less about what the decision was made and more about how a decision has been made. Did it take into consideration irrelevant factors, and did it take into consideration or fail to take into consideration relevant factors, which are the two main themes of judicial review? And then were actions taken that were outside of the legal authority of said body? Typically, it's just against public bodies. But I did follow that case. It's a couple of years ago now. To move it on a little bit, actually, on the same subject. Could you very briefly just mention to people, what is the NEC? What is the National Executive Council of the Labour Party? Why does it matter who's on it?
Thanks, Mohamed. Well, the National Executive Committee is a body which is supposed to represent all the different sections of the Labour Party. So you have 9 elected representatives who are chosen by a ballot of members in the constituency parties. And that's the section in which I was elected and then expelled. You have trade union representatives. So every affiliated trade union has one or more representatives on the national executive. And then you have a number of people representing what are called the affiliated socialist societies, like the Jewish Labour Movement, the Socialist Health Association, and so on. And there are a whole number of those. And you also have members of the Parliamentary Labour Party represented there. There may be some sections that I've missed, but those are the main groups. So the total membership is about 39, I believe. We ought to check that, really, to be sure. I was very concerned about these details when I was standing for election, but now that I'm expelled, it's sort of faded from memory, I'm afraid. And the National Executive is, strictly speaking, the governing body of the Labour Party between conferences. So annual conferences are meant to be the policy-making bodies. This is more and more under threat. The National Executive is influential in that it makes decisions between conferences, but it's very much ruled by the leadership. And at the moment, that means Starmer and those who align with him. So the number of people on the left, on the National Executive at the moment is tiny. There are 4 constituency representatives who were on the slate with me, who have been elected. There are probably an equal number, maybe a few more, representatives of left-wing unions. And there are one really, other member of the National Executive who is open to challenging when procedures are clearly falling down. I'll mention somebody by name because she is noteworthy, Anne Black, who does really thorough reports of every National Executive full committee meeting or subcommittee meetings. And she has been very concerned about the use of this retroactive prohibition, auto-exclusion of individuals. And she's been quite helpful in quizzing the leadership and getting numbers. For example, more than 300 individuals have been auto-excluded. We don't know, she doesn't know, how many have appealed. I have appealed, and we know dozens of people who have appealed. No appeal has yet been upheld. So basically, the NEC auto-excludes you, you appeal. They usually completely ignore the appeals, actually. I mean, some people have had their appeals ignored for a year and more. No response whatsoever. So there's no process, really, for dealing with appeals. 1 or 2 people have started to have letters saying, we acknowledge you appealed, we don't care, you're auto-excluded anyway. So a few auto-exclusions have been upheld. So the NEC runs this process. Now, there's another body called the National Constitutional Commission, which was set up in the 80s, so it's long established. And it was set up because there have been problems with the perceived independence of the disciplinary process. So there was a perceived need to have a body to which people could appeal and to which controversial cases could be referred for judgment. And for a while, when Corbyn was the leader, and there was a little bit of a balance on the National Executive, he never fully controlled it. That's a myth, the idea that the party was run by the hard left, as if there is a hard left. But it was run by its supporters of Corbyn. It never was. But there was a period when the National Constitutional Commission had enough people elected to it, so that when cases went before them, they would attempt to give it a fair hearing. So the NCC would set up panels of 3. Prior to the Corbyn days, those 3 were always 2 on the right and 1 maybe a bit on the left, and people were just automatically judged to have been guilty, whatever. So that's the panel that Ken Livingstone went before, for example, and Jackie Walker and Mark Wadsworth. Chris Williamson never really got that far. He was initially allowed back into the party after suspension by a panel of the NEC. And well,
And then resuspended. Yeah.
then resuspended, and then decided it wasn't worth a candle and resigned and stood against the party, which has left him a bit in the wilderness.
Yeah. Well, I think they withdrew the whip though, which is why he stood against. So they refused to recognize him as a Labour member when he was still running for re-election, and then so he could either just decide not to run or to stand as an independent, which is what he did, right? But that was like last minute as well when they withdrew the whip. So if he didn't leave, I think they withdrew the whip at the time. So yeah, I would like to ask you, but I don't think maybe you'd be open to discussing this in a separate. We could just do a standalone interview just on, why try to continue dealing with the Labour Party. I mean, it seems that the entire structure, and this includes when Corbyn was leader and when the vast majority of the party membership supported the Corbyn project. We know this because most of the membership joined because in order to vote for Corbyn or joined after Corbyn became leader. I think it was at one point the largest party in Europe in terms of party membership. So I think there is a question as to how much emphasis should be placed on trying to get some degree of fairness out of a system, a very Kafkaesque and I have to say undemocratic and non-transparent structure that exists in the Labour Party, rather than simply people organizing and trying to get the best out of their MPs or working with third parties, some of the other political parties. But we don't have time to go into that. So if you're interested, that is something I'd like to maybe just have a single discussion about. But if you do have time, I would like to briefly address the so-called anti-boycott law, because I know that's something that you wanted to discuss. So I'll just explain briefly for viewers who don't know, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts about it. In June of this year, that's June 2023, the Tory government proposed an anti-boycott bill, specifically targeting the boycott, divestment, or specifically citing the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, or BDS, which seeks to compel the apartheid state of Israel to adhere to its legal obligations under international law in respect of its treatment of the indigenous Palestinian population. According to the UK government's own press release, the Economic Activity of Public Bodies Bill, which has been described as the anti-boycott bill, quote, intends to prevent public bodies when making decisions about procurement or investment from considering a country or territory of origin or other territorial considerations in a way that indicates political or moral disapproval of a foreign state. Such boycotts or divestments by public bodies would potentially be liable to investigation and fines under the legislation. The government states that the bill aims to stop councils and other publicly funded bodies from, quote, pursuing their own foreign policy agendas, end quote. In particular, it cites concerns that campaigns in universities and local authorities on investment decisions relating to certain countries, quote, lead to community tensions, and in the case of Israel, a rise in anti-Semitism, end quote. Much of the debate on this issue has focused on suggested boycotts of Israel and Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. This is still from the press release. The bill does not prevent public bodies from complying with formal UK sanctions or embargoes. Noticeably, the statement makes clear that, quote, the government intends for Russia and Belarus to be exempted immediately upon commencement of the bill, once the bill becomes law, should it become law. So which is an interesting, it's a very clear statement that what they have in mind when pushing this bill is the BDS movement targeting Israel or seeking to pressure Israel on issues of apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and so on and so forth. Currently, the bills, the anti-boycott bills at the report stage, which occurs after members of the House of Commons have debated and read through the bill, I think even voted on it, at least at that stage, but provides MPs with time to consider further possible amendments to it. So, Naomi, what can you tell us about the economic activity of public bodies bill that hasn't already been mentioned. What's its current status politically? Because legally it's going through this process at report stage, but politically, is this in terms of support from the Labour Party or the Tories or any of the other political parties?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for that question, Mohamed. Well, a very significant element in what's going on with this bill, well, there are a number actually, but one is that there is a House of Commons committee hearing submissions about the bill at the moment. I think it's already started. I'm not at liberty to tell you the details of any submissions, that the content of which I'm aware, but there are a number of submissions going in which point out what is wrong with this bill. And it has to be seen in the context of the broad attacks on our civil liberties, right to protest, right to freedom of speech, and so on and so on. It's definitely part of that panoply of draconian laws which this Tory government is bringing in, and sadly, which the Labour opposition doesn't seem to be particularly exercised about opposing. This is one of the issues on which people need to be putting pressure on the Labour leadership and Labour MPs to stay where they stand on this. Though I do take your point about whether we should be focusing all that much on Labour these days, but that's, as you said, a different issue. So the other important point about this bill is it has attracted opposition from a large range of civil society organisations. More than 70 have now signed a right to boycott statement. The Trade Union Congress voted in support of this campaign. It includes trade unions, it includes civil liberties organisations, including Liberty, it includes faith groups, freedom of speech groups, and so on. So it is recognised as a threat to the civil society's ability to express a view and to act in accordance with people's consciences in making, in this case, it's about investment decisions primarily. So it's critically important because it proposes limitations on UK organisations' freedom to make their own decisions about the resources that they control. So local authority pensions funds and universities and colleges that have funds that they invest. And secondly, it gives an exceptional role to Israel in the drafting of the legislation and in its proposed implementation. So basically, as you quoted, the decision maker must not have regard to a territorial consideration in a way that could be interpreted as being influenced by political or moral disapproval of foreign state conduct. But their exemptions may apply, but it's specifically stated that Israel is not an exception that may apply. So the targeting of the Palestinian-led civil society boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign is absolutely clear, and it's very important that we do mobilise against this. So influencing lawmakers, members of parliament, is really important on this one. And obviously we would expect that there will be members of the Labour Party MPs who will want to take this up. But given the current state of fear and general, lack of backbone among those who we would hope would stand up for freedom of speech and civil liberties in the Labour Party, it needs a lot of pressure from below. So, I mean, I think it is very worrying legislation, and it probably will pass. And when it does, it may well be open to legal challenge. Well, I think that the freedom of organisations with funds under their control to decide on any basis that they see fit, including a moral or ethical basis, what they do with those funds is threatened by this bill. And it seems extraordinary that it's even being contemplated, really.
I mean, the one interesting thing about it, and maybe you may well know more, I hope you do, actually, because then you can answer my question, is And I haven't had the opportunity to review the entirety of the legislation, which, frankly, even though I come from a law background, it can be rather tedious just going through bills. Like, you have to set aside time, especially since some of these things are 100, 200 pages long. But in brief, based on what I read from the government's website, the considerations you're not permitted to have would be moral considerations. But given the fact that the foundational premise of BDS, while obviously there's a clear moral and ethical element, it is not rooted in morality or ethics in terms of the core aspects of the movement as I read it, especially if you go to the main websites of BDS. It's rooted in international law. So do you know what the bill says in relation to adherence to international law? Because when investment decisions are being made, the argument is typically, not as far as I'm aware, it's not, and that could just lead to a different strategy then. Instead of simply going to local council and saying it's immoral for you to be supporting apartheid, the argument would be it is illegal for you to be supporting apartheid because apartheid is a crime against humanity. It is recognized as a crime against humanity. Ethnic cleansing is recognized as a war crime and a crime against humanity. These colonies or settlements, supporting them is in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, the Geneva Conventions, which prohibit occupying powers from colonizing land, and the UK government's officially stated position, whether or not they back it up in practice, but their officially stated position is all of these colonies, all of these settlements are illegal under international law. So surely that would be a giant gaping hole in the ability of the anti-boycott bill from actually preventing such divestment, so long as the language is clear that they're based on legal and not, heaven forbid, moral or ethical considerations. Is that your understanding of it?
Mohamed, yes, you summed it up very well. And that last element about international law is really critical. As far as I'm aware, the new bill doesn't make any reference to that at all. And of course, it's true that BDS has for a long time said that what we are trying to do here is challenge Israel to stand by its obligations under international law. So no to illegal settlement in the occupied territories and in Gaza. And that is, as you quite rightly say, it's actually British government policy, though never adhered to. It opposes the wall, which cuts off Palestinians from their own land. That's also illegal. And the right of return of refugees is also another issue that is important for boycott. And these are all recognized rights that Palestinians have to freedom, justice, and equality under international law. That's very important. And I think when we are working for, the ethical foreign policy idea or the ethical investment campaign is relevant, and it's quite consistent with what we've just been saying about international law. It turns out that if you have an ethical attitude to what's going on in Israel-Palestine, you are also going to be arguing for the defense of international law. So I do think that the bill is a dog's breakfast, as people sometimes say. It is a real mess, and I don't know how they are going to implement it. And it will be very interesting to see what the House of Commons committee, which is reviewing it at the moment, comes up with. They're getting some very intelligent, well thought out submissions from a whole range of organisations, including Jewish organisations. There's a big campaign with many, many civil society groups, as we've already mentioned, including the TUC and major unions. Obviously, Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Campaigning for nuclear disarmament is on the list. Everybody who's ever shown any concern for human rights and the rights of the right to lead to, or how should I put this, the right to be considered consistently with international law. All these people are lining up on this, and there is actually a day of action planned on Saturday, October the 7th, which will bring together all these different forces. The TUC is defending the idea that the bill should be rejected, and so on and so on. The Welsh government has joined its Scottish counterparts in taking that position. So it's definitely open to a huge challenge. People in the Christian community have also taken this up because they can see that it's not only a threat to people in support of Palestine, actually, it's also a threat to people wanting to use ethical investment decisions in favour of the climate, particularly. In fact, it's really the excuse for bringing it in now is to stop people making decisions or to taking action in support of Just Stop Oil, for example, and things like that. It's one of the panoply of regulations that we're facing is targeting environmental activism as well. So we should have many, many allies in fighting this very dangerous piece of legislation.
So people who want to know more about that day of action, they can go to which website does JVL?
I better send you that information because I've just got a link to it here in a document. I haven't actually. I don't think we've put anything online about it ourselves. I'll send you a link.
Okay, and before we let you go, Naomi, where can people go to either learn more about JVL or support or JVL, work with it?
Yeah. People don't realize that, like the Jewish Labour movement, which is the Zionist affiliate to the Labour Party, which has Jewish members, but many non-Jewish members. We also have non-Jewish members. So we're very keen for people who want to support our work, which is now oriented increasingly towards the broader Labour and progressive movement because of the developments that you've referred to, Mohamed, about the state of the Labour Party these days. So, yes, please go to the Jewish Voice for Labour website, which is very well regarded, jvl.org.uk, easy to remember. You can join there. You can sign up for education workshops that we provide, which give people the chance to explore anti-Semitism in the context of the broader fight against racism, and to do so in a reflective and considered way, a safe space. People can ask questions that they would probably feel very nervous about asking in most other settings because of the climate these days, where questioning certain interpretations of what anti-Semitism is will get you labelled an anti-Semite and could be career-threatening, actually. So please do look at what we do. Remember that we're very willing and we're very keen, actually, to have support from anybody who's involved in trade union activism, anti-racist activism. If you're fighting for the rights of renters in your local community, if you're defending migrant rights, the right to food. I mean, there are so many campaigns going on where there are radical people desperate for alternatives to the current politics on offer. And we're very keen that the kind of conversations that we started to have when Corbyn was in the leadership of the Labour Party are allowed to continue, because in a sense there's a whole political discourse which is being wiped off the face of the sort of, certainly the media conversation, and we need it to be back in there. We need people to be confident and support one another, and that's we're engaged with any activities that promote that bringing together of progressive forces despite the defeats that we've suffered.
Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi, thank you very much for joining us on Truth Defence.
My absolute pleasure, Mohamed. Thank you very much for having me.